Peace. We're going to continue our reading in Race First today. Hope your day is great. Sending you some positive energy. Let's get it in. Garvey's reflections on political theory and especially on democracy found expression in his conception of his ownership, though at times showing a tendency toward the autocratic. He was nevertheless imbued with a consuming notion of service, which led to a fatalistic acceptance of sacrifice as the inevitable consequence of leadership, despite occasional complaints concerning the difficulties of race leadership and the unworthiness of errant colleagues. Garvey's concept of leadership as, as dedication, sacrifice, and even martyrdom was matched by a loyalty among large numbers of his followers, which astounded observers. Kelly Miller of Howard University, one of the small number of non-Garveyite Afro-American intellectuals who attempted to analyze him with some semblance of objectivity, wrote that it must be conceded that he has begotten for himself an intensity of discipleship which has no parallel among Negroes in his country. Miller noted that on the death of Frederick Douglass, Howard University, of which Douglass had been a trustee, could raise only a few $1,000s to endow a school in his honor. The Douglass home had similarly failed to become a mecca for the race. In the case of Booker T. Washington, also, his camp followers, many of whom were indebted to him for their exalted positions, were indifferent to the attempt to raise an endowment of $500,000 in his honor. This contrasted sharply with the devotion of Garvey's followers, even, and indeed more so, after his incarceration. T. Thomas Fortune, veteran civil rights fighter, dean of African American journalists, former close associate of Booker T. Washington, and for the last few years of his life, editor of the Negro World, made a similar observation. The editor of the Negro World is in a position to judge of this matter because he has been actively engaged in race journalism for 45 years and has known every leader of the race in America and in other lands during that time, personally or by reputation, from Frederick Douglass to Marcus Garvey. None of them had the magnetic personality of Marcus Garvey, or Mr. Garvey, should I say. None of them could draw men to him and hold them as he. None of them had a world-embracing slogan that appealed to the Negro people everywhere. A petition from the Jacksonville, Florida, UNIA division to President Coolidge for Garvey's release from prison expressed the same idea in a more poignant fashion. The world has never had a character, a leader such as Marcus Garvey, one of the most inspiring and courageous idealists in history. And this Marcus Garvey is all the Negro has ever had. To the official mind of an Attorney General of the United States, such loyalty was irrational and disturbing. He explained his perplexity in a memorandum to President Coolidge. The situation as presented in the Garvey case is most unusual, notwithstanding the fact that the prosecution was designed for the protection of colored people, whom it was charged Garvey had been defrauding by means of exaggerated and incorrect statements circulated through the mail. None of these people apparently believe they have been defrauded, manifestly retained their entire confidence in Garvey, and instead of the prosecution and imprisonment of the applicant being an example and warning against a violation of law, it really stands and is regarded by them as a class, as an act of oppression of the race and their efforts in the direction of race progress and of discrimination against Garvey as a Negro. This is by no means a healthy condition of affairs. Such loyalty manifested itself in thousands of letters, telegrams, petitions, and the like, which poured in the departments of the United States and other governments whenever Garvey was unfairly dealt with. It manifested itself, too, in such scenes as those enacted during Garvey's trial in 1923 for alleged mail fraud. Hundreds of his supporters knelt, prayed, lamented, and allegedly threatened witnesses. The police wagon carrying Garvey to prison was obstructed by an estimated 300 people, and in the quaint language of the New York Times, several negresses showed marked emotion. This paper was as perplexed by the manifestations of devotedness as had been the Attorney General of the United States, and in an editorial entitled "A Hero More Sorry, Unimaginable," it chided Garvey supporters. Surely there ought to be intelligence enough among the colored people to see that Garvey illustrated their worst and weakest qualities, not their best and strongest. This loyalty was manifested too in the fact that only about 18 persons out of the 35,000 Black Star Line stockholders written to by United States government officials who see the company's books, were willing to agree that they were dissatisfied with the company's operations. All 18 were, Garvey thought, in the employ of the government. Many of these same stockholders were among those who subscribed. Hold on, let me make sure I didn't miss. Nope, I didn't miss not a thing. Many of these same stockholders were among those of the government. Oh, many of the same stockholders were among those who subscribed $4,400 toward the defense fund the very same night of his arrest. Such fundraising feats were quite commonplace. In 1921, Garvey collected an estimated $25,000 in Costa Rica, most of it within 48 hours. The United Fruit Company at Puerto Rico Barrios, Guatemala reported a sale of drafts destined to the UNIA and Black Star Line of $2,941.08 between November 21st and February 1922. This figure was considered an understatement. The population of the population of Puerto Barrios was given as only 2,400. Within a year of his release on bail in 1923, Garvey is said to have collected $150,000 balboas from followers in Panama. Are y'all paying attention to this? Is 1921, 1920. I'm talking like this is not 1990. This is 1920. He was building this money, building these enterprises, connecting with our people all over the world in the early 1900s, way before any of the internet or any of this that we have available today, right? Concerning such manifestations of loyalty, Negro World columnist S.A. Haynes concluded that Garvey had demonstrated two things, namely that black people could be organized and that they were indeed eager to repose confidence in and support sincere Negro leadership. This is graphically illustrated by a visitor to Garvey's Harlem offices in January 1920, who reported a line of people stretching over 100 yards along 135th Street waiting to see Garvey, some for no other reason than to personally express their appreciation to him. Not surprisingly, such fierce, unswerving loyalty was often branded fanaticism, and Garvey's critics and enemies did not hesitate to describe the style of leadership existing within Garvey's provisional African nation as fascist. These accusations were helped along by a strain of violence that seemed to run among Garveyites. Apart from anti-colonial struggles that seemed to in which they were implicated, such as the 1919 uprisings in Trinidad and British Honduras, Garveyites, particularly in the United States, were often implicated in violent confrontations with rival persons and groups. Possibly the most publicized of such cases involved the murder of former UNIA leader of the American Negroes, J.W.H. Eason, in New Orleans in 1923, after he had broken with Garvey W.A. Domingo, Jamaican ex-editor of the Negro World, reported that in New York City, as early as the fall of 1919, I raised my voice in protest against the execrable exaggerations, staggering stupidities, blundering bombast, and abominable obscenities of our Black Barnum, culminating in Thomas Potter and myself being assaulted, kicked, and placed under arrest by Garveyites in the spring of 1920. In August 1920, several hundred Garveyites invaded a revival meeting being held under a big tent at West 138th Street in Harlem by the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. The cause of this disturbance was the Reverend Charles S. Morris, veteran missionary from Norfolk, Virginia, whose sermon contained a rejection of Garvey's African program because, in his opinion, the colonialist powers were too strong to be dislodged. Uniformed police and plainclothesmen had to escort the reverend gentleman home, and by a circuitous route, since the most direct route went past Liberty Hall. W.E.B. Du Bois appended his name to the list of real potential victims of UNIA violence and threats. He was not only threatened with death by men declaring themselves his Garvey's followers, but received letters of such unbelievable filth that they were absolutely unprintable. His friends were moved, he declared, to provide him with secret police protection when he landed in the United States from his trip to Africa. Arguments over Garvey's trial sometimes turned peaceful gatherings, such as house parties, into brawls resulting in slashings and other injuries. A case similar to the Eason murder occurred in Miami in 1928. Here, Laura Champion, alias Laura Coffey, a self-styled African princess who unauthorized money collection endeavors from UNIA branches have been denounced by the organization, was killed at an anti-Garvey meeting she was addressing. Her followers murdered a Garveyite in retaliation. The president and the colonel of legions of the Miami UNIA division were charged with and acquitted of first-degree murder. The violent streak was not the only point of similarity between Garveyism and the doctrines of fascism and Nazism, which later flourished in Europe. In their fierce nationalism, in their doctrines of racial purity, in their in their uninformed, indoctrinated youth groups, in their conversation of the crowd into disciplined, uniformed units, with some qualifications in their anti-communism, in the impassioned oratory of their leaders, and the pageantry, the atmosphere of exciting surrounding their movements, European fascism and Nazism bore certain resemblances to Garveyism. The similarities were not lost upon contemporaries. J. A. Rogers noticed these during a trip to Mussolini's Italy in 1927. Writing from Italy for the Negro World, he said, "The other thing that made me feel at home, as I said, was fascism, or should I say Mussolini. I have been through the agitation that raged around Garvey in Harlem in 1922, and I have but to shut my eyes and ears to color the issues and watch human conduct to hear the same old tune singing to different words." 10 years later, Garvey himself impressed upon Rogers the fact that the UNIA had antedated Mussolini with the style of government associated with the latter. He said, "We were the first fascists. We had disciplined men, women, and children in training for the liberation of Africa. The black masses saw that in this extreme nationalism lay their only hope and readily supported it. Mussolini copied fascism from me, but the Negro reactionaries sabotaged it." In a speech the same year, 1937, delivered in Canada, Garvey emphasized the same point. The UNIA was before Mussolini and Hitler were heard of. Mussolini and Hitler copied the program of the UNIA, aggressive nationalism for the black man in Africa. On other occasions, he pointed out that he had preached race purity before Hitler. And in 1935, he told an interviewer in London, "They laughed at me because I dressed my followers up in uniforms and paraded them through the streets. But look what Mussolini and Hitler have done with shirts and uniforms. If I had been left alone, the Negro too would have had a shirt." Oh, that's what he's saying. If I had been left alone, the Negro too would have had a shirt. The question of fascism recurred often in Garvey's various publications. In 1923, for example, the New York Amsterdam News quoted a Negro World editorial which claimed that the UNIA had accomplished a bloodless revolution more far-reaching than fascism. In 1929, a black man editorialized while Garvey was in jail to the effect that Marcus Garvey is the Mussolini of the Negro race and no other Negro can or has come up to him as a fighter for the liberties and rights of a people. Garvey himself identified one trait he admired in Mussolini as his iron-fisted rule, which Garvey considered necessary at some stages of history. Garvey's interest in Hitler coincided with his rise to influence in Germany. Indeed, even before Hitler's journey to power, Garvey, on a visit to Germany in 1928, was impressed by German thoroughness and discipline. He suggested that black people might profitably imbibe these qualities. In 1932, that's a great word. I never heard of that. IMBIBE. Oh yeah, I'm going to be using that soon. He suggested that black people might profitably imbibe these qualities. In 1932, the editor of his New Jamaican praised Hitler's role as a patriot, a view that Garvey shared. Garvey hoped that the black race would produce a Hitler and that black people would acquaint themselves with Hitler's ideas. By 1934, though, mindful of his own experiences in the United States and Jamaica, he concluded that a black Hitler could be permanently successful only in Africa. For Africa afforded a far greater opportunity for an appeal along nationalistic lines than areas in the African dispersion. Garvey's admiration for Hitler and Mussolini was not, however, an unqualified one. His admiration was based on the objective consideration of their political style and philosophy. He was too astute not to realize, however, that their theories could spell only ruin for Africa, and he opposed them resolutely on this basis. As early as 1924, he dispatched a telegram to Mussolini from the Fourth International Convention of Negro Peoples of the World, requesting a change in Mussolini's Africa policy and self-determination for Italian colonies in Africa. His dual attitude of limited endorsement and hostile opposition to Hitler and Mussolini can be best explained by a 1933 statement on Hitler. Adolf Hitler, the German chancellor, cannot be mistaken for anything less than a patriot. We are interested in Hitler only from the point of view of Germany's relationship with our race. It is evident that if Hitler hates the Jew, he also hates the Negro. Whilst we admire him as a German nationalist, or rather patriot, we must not do so to the loss of our nationalism or patriotism. Therefore, it would be very unwise for us to encourage one as pronounced in his view as Hitler. Hitler stands for the greater Germany, which is his right, and the Negro should stand for a greater Africa, which is also our right. His opposition to Mussolini was couched in similar terms, and the Negro World editorial of 1928 argued that Mussolini was not only aware of Garvey, but considered him a menace to his plans for Italian imperialism in Africa. The editorial quoted from a speech in which Mussolini had referred to a Harlem riot. There is one great quarter in New York called Harlem, where the population is exclusively Negro. A great riot broke out there last July, which, after a whole night of sanguinary conflict, was finally controlled by the police, who found themselves opposed to compact masses of Negroes. The editorial commented that Mussolini's account was exaggerated and represented an indirect warning to the United States that Afro-American race consciousness was a menace to his schemes in Africa, especially since he knew that Garvey's program came out of Harlem. The editorial continued. He may not call Marcus Garvey by name, but Negroes throughout the world know that he regards Garvey as the most potential hindering force to his scheming and planning to lay robber hands on Africa's wealth. It ended in prophetic vein. We are somewhat puzzled, in common with other beholders, at the new attitude for Ras Tafari toward the ancient enemy of Ethiopia, but we will not take hasty judgment. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Garvey's opposition became strident, and practically every issue of his Black Man was adorned with hostile articles and poems. The following from The Smell of Mussolini is typical. Let all Italians live and die in shame for what their mad dog did to our dear home. Their Mussolini's bloody savage name. Smell stinks from Addis back to sinful Rome. We'll march to crush the Italian dog, and at the points of gleaming, shining words, we'll lay quite low with the violent Roman hog. Garvey's concept of nationhood was therefore extremely well developed. He was a provisional nation biding the time of Africa's liberation within maybe 15 years, Garvey conjectured, while W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP will be sending up petitions to Congress asking them to introduce another dire anti-lynching bill. Marcus Garvey and the UNIA will be coming up the Hudson Bay with a flotilla of battleships, dreadnoughts, and cruisers to land our first ambassador, and whilst they will be introducing bills in Congress. We will be entertained in the White House as being the first ambassadors from the great African Republic, and let me tell you, they will hear us then. There can be no doubt that Garvey's assumption of nationality filled a great void in the lives of Black people, especially during his most successful years. Almost nowhere on the globe did Black people at this time have a government of their own race, and the UNIA, reaching as it did into every area where Black people lived, sowed the seeds of nationalism and on occasion even acted as a provisional government. With that, I'm going to say peace. We'll continue this again. Readers are leaders. You know what I mean? Help me out. We just reading aloud daily to inspire and encourage the rise of leadership and economic empowerment in our own communities. I love listening about Marcus Garvey. He is underappreciated and not as well known and talked about in our communities amongst our people. And he definitely was for the people. I hope you liked what you heard. We got more in store. We'll see you again. Peace. May your today be great, and may your tomorrow be even greater. Peace.